Hello everybody, my name is Adam Thorne and welcome to the Australian Aviation Podcast. Now, before I start with the formalities, you may, if you are watching on YouTube, the YouTubers, you'll notice that our studio has been upgraded yet again. Not only do we have these new stands for our microphones, rather than those awful kind of claws that came, well, they weren't awful, I don't want to begrudge the work of, but the kind of claws that got in the way. We now have these lovely stands which will allow you to see us better. What will also allow you to see us better is the fact, like real stars, we actually have big lights on us now. Jake, is there an aviation equivalent of this? I'm trying to think of something witty to go along with the stand and the lights. These are like the runway lights or something.
I mean, I'd say like it's like a new engine on a 737 Max, but we all know how those have been going.
Very badly. But this hasn't gone badly. This has gone very well, and he's out of shot. This is Enoch, our genius, who's kind of rebuilt this studio with his bare hands to make it much more professional. I think it's done a good job, don't you, Jake?
Absolutely. Especially since he's working with bare hands. Like, giant claws are not really...
Yeah, we can't actually show you because he doesn't look like a regular man. He is. He's a monster of a man.
Yeah, he's the only place that he could find employment is in a podcast studio away from the light of the sun.
Yes, working with aviation aficionados, which is...
the only thing more monstrous than a guy with bare claws for hands.
Did you ever used to watch Frasier? And there was a character in Frasier called Maris, who was Niles' wife. He was never
depicted on screen.
Never, but Niles would hint at how hideous she would be. He would hint in the things he said. Maybe this could be Enoch could become like a character, but nobody actually knows if he's real or not.
We just add more and more details to sort of add to Enoch's mystique. There's no one else in the studio with us at the moment. We're making this Enoch person up.
We are. But anyway, he's AI. That's what it is. He's artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's Enoch stands for electronic something operator of cool podcasts.
That's rubbish. You've really let yourself down there.
You put me on the spot, Adam.
Well, yeah, I think you put yourself on the spot, to be fair. Anyway, let's stop rambling. Actually, no, before we steam into the news, we do have actually a shout out from a former host. Do you remember that Chris bloke that we used to have? Mm-hmm. We've gone from eulogising him to just being like, oh, he's the old presenter. I forgot to bring my laptop up, so I'm reading this off my phone for those of you watching on the YouTube. Where is it, Chris? Chris was referring to our sometimes co-host Ben Foster, and Chris said, I am replaced by a great man. Congratulations, Ben, and welcome to the best team at Momentum Media, being the Australian aviation team. Certainly miss Adam and Jake, that's me and you, and our weekly podcast, but I know you're joining the team and it is in great hands. Loved watching this one, guys. Great stuff. So we're doing all right. Like, Chris is he still likes it.
Yeah. Of course, Chris had no idea that scant weeks after him posting that comment, you would abandon both me and Ben when your old best friend, Boo, came back, tossing us aside like a couple of empty salted peanut packets.
So, for those of you that aren't aware, Boo is like you, Jake, but cooler and better in every regard, and that's why I had to just toss you aside. You were gone without even a goodbye. Get out of my house, and I welcomed him back. He was a fighter pilot. He actually flew Hornets. What have you done?
But now Boo has gone away, hasn't he?
Yeah,
and look who's come crawling back.
We're desperate.
Look who's come crawling back.
Yes. We're desperate. We're desperate. It's a talent crisis, and I have a talent back, and now my talent's gone. But we're making do with you.
Unbelievable, Adam. The betrayal still stinks.
If you wanted to get me back, you could just walk out of the studio now, and then they'd be like, "Oh, what work have you done in the last week?" And I'd be like, "I don't know what's going on in the news." So then I'd be finished. But you won't do that, will you? No.
Leave it with me.
Yes, no. Anyway, we've talked enough nonsense. We should actually talk about the week's news. And mere minutes before, actually it was about an hour before we started recording this show, we have one of the biggest stories of the year.
Already?
Already?
I mean, to be fair, it's not been much
there's not much
yet,
to compare it to. Jake, go on, steam in.
We may recall that Alan Joyce, the CEO of Qantas, departed. The maestro, the one and only, departed Qantas last year. This just today, Tuesday, as we're recording, we're like an hour or two out from an announcement that happened just today. Jayne Hrdlicka, the CEO of Virgin, the biggest rival to Qantas, second largest airline group in Australia, has also stepped down in a shocking announcement. She said, quote, "I've decided the time is right for me to signal CEO transition for this great airline and ultimately to pass the baton on. This is not a decision I've taken lightly, but the last 4 years have been heavy lifting across the organization during the toughest of times. We're in the midst of the next phase of our transformation program." I like that transformation program. It's great to when you're on a plane and it turns into a giant robot.
It's not Transformers. But go on.
Then what the hell was I flying? There is a lot to do and an IPO to deliver. The next phase of this journey is another 3 to 5 years, making now the perfect juncture to begin the process of leadership transition to deliver the next few chapters of what I'm sure will be a significant long-term success story. She said, "I am very proud of what the Virgin Australia team have accomplished together since the depths of administration and the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm honoured to have been given the opportunity to guide this team to the point on its journey, and I very much look forward to seeing the continued success of Virgin Australia."
Now, what was one of the kind of intriguing things about this is we really had no idea this was coming. There was no rumours. So
no, absolutely. I mean, with Alan Joyce, you knew he was going to. We knew he was going to resign, but we didn't know he was going to resign so soon.
Yes.
He moved up his departure date.
And also, when Jayne replaced Paul Scurra, the previous CEO, there were the rumours in the papers for a long time, both that he was going to leave and that Jayne was going to come in to replace him. This time, there's been no leak. There's been no fore-announcement here.
Just a bombshell.
Just a bombshell, yeah. So just because I've not even this, I came into the office and Jake was like, oh my god, and I was like, don't talk to me, right, man, right. We're competing against other news outlets. We need those sweet views and Google rankings. So is she going immediately, or is she hanging on for a little bit?
The release didn't say. It was talking about a transition, so presumably she's not. It's not as of today. Like they didn't announce an acting CEO or anything like that. They are going to be looking globally for her replacement. So presumably it's not she's walking out the door at 5 p.m. today and going, see you later.
Yeah. It also doesn't sound that she's been pushed or that she's been dismissed.
No.
Firstly, I think it's fair to say she has done an exceptional job in that she took over, I think it was, late 2020. So Paul Scurra did have a little bit of time in after administration. But
this was October 2020.
Yeah, October 2020. So she had this incredibly difficult start in that at this point in time, Australia had just kind of come out of a series of lockdowns. Melbourne was starting to come out of its lockdown. We thought that was it for COVID. Obviously, then 6 months later, we have more nationwide lockdowns. So you had that up and down, which was very difficult to deal with. She had to take the company effectively out of administration and completely rethink it. So that involved obviously kind of rebooting and retooling the leadership team, but also having a totally new strategy. And that was of being a kind of hybrid airline. So not a budget airline per se, not necessarily a full service airline like Qantas, but something in the middle. And she's made that work to the point that for the first time in 8 or 9 years, I say for the first time that they've turned a profit. It's
also in 11 years.
Yeah, in 11 years. But also when they went into administration, and I might have the exact figure wrong, it was something like $7 or $8 billion worth of debt that the old Virgin Australia was in. So financially speaking, the company was a disaster. So to go from that to making money during that post-COVID period is very difficult. Now, you could say, oh, yes, but Qantas made a lot of money. But you've got to understand that when Virgin came out of administration, initially they substantially reduced their fleet. So they had started from a much smaller base. They had to kind of rebuild their fleet.
Out went the 777s, out went the A330s, and all of those other sort of longer haul that basically went to almost an entirely a 737-800 fleet.
Yes. So she's had to completely rethink the fleet. When she started off, there was initially, and we will get to this fuller in a second, there was initially a lot of bad blood with the unions, not so much the unions and Virgins, but the unions with her personally and her experiences and kind of a previous life as the CEO of Jetstar. So she had to repair those relationships. And to come through all of that, to remake the airline, to make it profitable, to get it onto a point where it is is now looking to relist on the ASX, I would say is a job very well done in very trying circumstances. Now, the other thing to say, and we shouldn't be crass enough necessarily to speculate on exactly what has happened, but obviously she had a very difficult time in her personal life with her husband that so sadly passed away. So she's had to deal with that. She's had to deal with one of the toughest periods to be an airline CEO. To come through that in one piece, she's done an excellent job. Her reasoning, effectively saying it's almost like effectively what she's saying is this part of a journey is done.
I've done everything that I needed to do.
Yes.
It's now time for someone else to take up the torch.
I think when you look at all of these kind of resignation speeches and stuff, it's always tempted to kind of read between the lines and see what's really going on. I'm tempted at face value to believe what she's saying. It does make sense. And if you were her, you probably think, well, I've kind of made my mark. I've had my almost 4 years or 3.5 years in charge. It does make sense now to have somebody else to take them on to the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. And it will be interesting to see who the Virgin board picks to replace her. No doubt the speculation on the second season of the Game of Planes.
It's Plane of Thrones.
It's the Game of Planes,
no, it's
Adam.
Plane of Thrones.
A Plane of Thrones is a plane where every seat is a throne, which admittedly would be nice.
If you say Plane of Thrones, people said to me, they'd be like, "That's genius. You've done it again." If you go Game of Planes,
who said that to you, Adam?
People, and I'm not going to name them. They've asked to remain anonymous.
People said to me, everyone said to me, they said, "Sir, Plane of Thrones, it's the best. It's the most brilliant name that I've ever heard for anything in my life." And you know what? They were right. Okay, they were right.
Girl, I don't know what to say to that. Anyway, so who could be who are the names? Like, we don't know. We will obviously speculate. Who are the names in the frame? And could we see the glorious second coming of the maestro, Alan Joyce?
I don't know if Joycey would be the Joycey.
Yeah.
I think Joyce probably will want to steer clear of the aviation sector for a while, given all the troubles he had at Qantas. As far as who it could be, it's really sort of up in the air. I mean, it's been, a couple of hours as of the time of recording since this resignation landed in our email inboxes. So whether they'll want to promote internally like Qantas did with Vanessa Hudson, whether they'll want to look outside, whether they'll maybe want to poach someone from another airline, it's really difficult to say. Hopefully they will bring in someone who does still have airline experience and not, some finance guy with
This is, again, we don't want to diminish the job he did. With Air New Zealand, they brought in Greg Foran, who effectively had no airline background at all. He was an incredibly successful businessman. I think he was working in the US previously, but for him to come in just as COVID started was effectively, there's an element that was a disastrous situation of one's fault.
So they brought him in from overseas?
Yes.
He was a foreign hire?
Well, no, I think I might be wrong. I think he's Kiwi, but he'd worked in the US.
See, because his name is foreign, and that sounds kind of like the word foreign.
I see what you've done.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's been a long day. I can't. I'm already probably getting facts wrong here. This is the Australian Aviation Podcast. We don't always.
It's not the New Zealand Aviation Podcast.
No, you can forgive me that after a long day. So we're going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot of speculation as to who will take this over. Now, I would say that Jayne has done a superb job in very difficult circumstances. I would argue that the next person has an equally as difficult job, because even though it is the case that Virgin did turn a profit, it was a very small profit, and it was, I think it was like 100 and something million, but it certainly wasn't the 2.5 billion monster profit that Qantas were able to make.
Well, it's kind of, in a weird way, it's like a mirror to the situation that Vanessa Hudson is facing, because whoever replaces Jayne Hrdlicka will replace, a CEO under whom you could argue the company has done very, very well and had a very good reputation coming out of COVID. Whereas Hudson was replacing someone under whom during COVID the airline had taken a significant knock to its reputation coming out of COVID.
But financially had done well.
Very well.
That's a very good point. But so one of the concern is that Virgin have, and we don't know, the concern is that Virgin did well because because of this post-COVID boom, this kind of, as Joyce would call it, the pent-up demand for travel. And the worry would be that they've kind of ridden that wave, and as that wave is starting to come to an end, they have to deal with the reality. And the argument would be that the new Virgin, are going to have a lot of the same problems as the older iteration of Virgin Australia. Now, admittedly, the new Virgin Australia isn't going to be trying to increase its capacity and be as aggressive as taking on Qantas, but it's still going to have to find its little niche to survive against this beast of a Qantas group.
The new Virgin also is not going to have Tiger attached to it,
That's
which is another
true.
thing. I think Virgin, when Tiger went under, it was not doing well. I mean, this was before my time at Australian Aviation, but when Tiger went under, it was not doing well anyway. So Virgin is not going to. Correct me if I'm wrong, Adam.
Yeah, exactly. So they don't have that. But the other argument as well is that the hybrid position is almost like a holding pattern. Are they going to fully become budget? Are they fully going to go, the other way? How is that going to land? And there's an argument that in that tricky post-COVID period, you could maybe get away with it, but it's going to be much more difficult in the next couple of years. The other issue they're going to have is they obviously, whatever they may or may not have said, they had hoped that Virgin would be back on the ASX by now. I think the first announcement, the formal announcement they made they were looking to go back on the ASX was 12 months ago, and they were putting out the feelers then. So the argument is that they wanted to do it. They thought now is the time to strike. They maybe didn't necessarily have the initial interest they had hoped for, so that was put back, and now things are going to be a little bit more tricky. So whoever it is that does come in, it's a very, very high profile job, but it's going to be a very, very difficult job as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And, to Jayne Hrdlicka, best of luck with whatever she decides to do next. I think, she can walk out of Virgin with her head held high.
And as well, Jayne, if you are listening and you would like to come on the Australian Aviation Podcast, we had your predecessor, Paul Scurra, and he was a fantastic guest. We obviously have, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, we've had the Bonza CEO, Tim Jordan, on the podcast multiple times.
And again, coming very, very soon.
And very, very, very soon, very, very soon. If you are listening, or if you are from the Virgin team, you'd love to come on. We'd love to have you. We'd love to hear about your experiences of what is it like to guide an airline through the toughest period, since World War II for airlines. We'd love to have you on. Shameless.
Certainly the toughest
out.
period since late 2001.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, welcome back. So we've obviously had this kind of bombshell announcement that we spoke about previously from Virgin, but actually the kind of the biggest story of the last couple of weeks has been this ongoing strike by the pilots of Network Aviation. And for those of you that are unfamiliar, this is essentially a subsidiary of Qantas, or a subsidiary of QantasLink, that predominantly does a lot of the FIFO flights in WA.
FIFO and QantasLink regular passenger transport.
Regular passengers. And a lot of it, I call it FIFO, apparently you call it FIFO.
Yeah. It's
FIFO's still right though, isn't it?
I've generally heard it pronounced FIFO. I don't know if FIFO is also correct.
But as I'm British, I'm probably saying it correctly. So let's just take that as probably I'm speaking His Majesty's English. So.
Yeah, but I mean, how well has His Majesty been speaking his own English?
He speaks it very well. He speaks it everywhere. Let's not do another joke. Right, let's get into it. What is the situation with these strikes? Because they've been going on for weeks now.
Yeah, so there's like these series of 24-hour rolling strikes that have been extended multiple times over the past couple of weeks. The issue is, the issues are there's been this list of demands that these pilots from the Australian Federation of Airline Pilots have put to Qantas, have put to Network and to Qantas, that Qantas is not meeting. So Qantas Network Aviation and Qantas, they're offering a 25% pay rise, which AFAP says it would only serve to bring the lowest paid pilots in the Qantas group up to the rates in the Air Pilots Award, which the Fair Work Commission considers to be the bare legal minimum. What the network pilots are looking for is 2-hour sign-on from reserve, up from 90 minutes, 6 a.m. start after a day off instead of 4 a.m., which is what pilots at other QantasLink and Qantas operations get. Duty travel in business class seats where available to improve the opportunity for rest and fatigue management. The same duty hours allowance as for pilots at other Qantas and QantasLink operations. Overtime increased using the same formula as for other Qantas and QantasLink pilots. 10 rostered days off which is again similar to other Qantas and QantasLink pilots, and a revised rostering appendix providing better rostering rules. Those are the 7 demands that these pilots have put to Network over and over again, they say.
One of the intriguing things about this, which I haven't really seen before in the time I've covered the aviation beat here, is that they essentially kind of announced a couple of days of strikes and then at the very last minute announced that those strikes would be extended, and then as soon as they were over they announced another strike. So everything's happening very much trying to catch Qantas out. Now, one of the reasons for this may well be that on the previous occasions there have been these pilot strikes. Qantas have almost tried to kind of break the picket line by flying in their bigger aircraft, flying in other pilots to try to keep the operations going.
And this has happened this time as well.
Yeah, this has happened this time as well. And without telling you the sort of story behind the story, after we had this announcement that the strikes are being extended, we got a very long response from Qantas, a statement sent out to the media outlining how they were going to try and keep things going, which is understandable because they have to keep people in the air. But I would imagine that those tactics have probably riled Network Aviation, have riled those
Probably,
union
yes. And you'd have to think that the pilots, I mean, you know, there's apparently there've been reports of, like, you know, these pilots who are flying these 737s and these other planes to, you know, break the strike. That, you know, like AFAP is, or you know, at least pilots or people allied with the union have been blasting this as like scab labor, essentially. You can't imagine that those pilots who are flying those, you know, borrowed 737s or those other charter planes are going to be terribly popular with AFAP.
No, it's very true. The other intriguing thing is how, and again, it's not just the FIFO flights, but how FIFO has become so important to major airlines. In the last year, we obviously had Rex kind of expand their reach into that world. We had Qantas attempt to buy Alliance. And essentially what was previously a quiet area of aviation has been seen as more and more important because this is reliable money. You know, we've just come out of COVID. We've obviously got the war in Ukraine. We've got obviously the Israel and Gaza situation. You've got talk that we're into an unstable 10 years kind of geopolitically. And what we know is that almost no matter how bad things get, you will need those flights. They are regularly going to make money. It's nice and safe. So this kind of hurts Qantas quite a lot. And obviously as well, the more disruption that there has on there, the more in danger those kind of contracts, those mining contracts become. And particularly as well, when you are also going after QantasLink flights, people that really rely on these flights that can't necessarily easily jump on another service, it cuts them very deep. It's hard to know how this is going to end. I think I'm right in saying that Qantas are kind of trying to force the hand by getting the Fair Work.
Yeah, so they've taken an intractable bargaining application to the Fair Work Commission, basically saying, it's been 18 months we've been negotiating this new agreement. The union's not budging. We can't budge. They've asked the Fair Work Commission to basically step in and sort it out for them.
Mm. Well, we will certainly be keeping on top of this, though it is kind of hard to know where it's going to end. Okay, welcome back. So, next story we're going to talk about is actually a very ongoing story. Now, this is the ACCC. Who, at the start of COVID, and I think it was for a period of about 2 years, were asked by the Morrison government to produce kind of quarterly reports on the aviation industry. And this was because the Morrison government, quite correctly, saw that you were going to have a shutdown of the industry and then you were going to have it start up again. You were going to have all sorts of networks and services kind of switch hands, and you were going to have a once-in-a-generational change. And the government, the federal government at the time, said that we need the ACCC to effectively have special powers to keep a tab on this and make sure nobody is stepping out of line. And these quarterly reports actually become an incredibly useful tool, particularly for us journalists, because they were able to get hold of data and be able to get hold of information that previously or would otherwise be very difficult for us to get. And that is because as the ACCC, they can approach an airline or approach a company and they can request kind of competitive information. So this gave us a unparalleled look into how the recovery was working. Now, these reports continued all the way through into, I think it was 6 months ago, halfway through last year.
Yeah, about June last year.
Yeah, but we had our last one, and then their remit ended. And anyway, what the new Labour federal government did was to come in and basically quickly restart these again because we've still had so much problems with delays and with cancellations, and the fact the industry isn't totally righted itself from COVID. We've had the first report drop a couple of weeks ago. Jake, what are they saying now?
So what they've said that since the peak in airfares in late 2022, domestic airfares have fallen over the last 12 months when adjusted for inflation. But even so, consumers would still be paying significantly more to fly in nominal terms than they did prior to the pandemic. So airfares have come down, but consumers are still kind of feeling the squeeze. And the ACCC has also noted that but more competition is still needed. So, there are now... They've pointed out that the aviation sector in Australia looks quite different domestically from where it was before the pandemic, because before the pandemic, Virgin was sort of positioned, alongside Qantas as a more premium carrier, whereas it had its Tiger Air arm for budget flights. Rex had not moved into domestic jet operations. Bonza was a twinkle in Tim Jordan's eye. Since the pandemic, Tiger's gone, as we've mentioned before. Virgin went into administration, came out as this hybrid mid-range thing. So Qantas and Jetstar have less competition on both the premium and the bottom end of the markets. You've got Rex now flying between capital cities on 737-800s, some of which used to be from Virgin. And of course, there's Bonza, Australia's first high-capacity airline in 15 years, that is doing this new thing of connecting all these holiday and regional destinations point to point without going through major capital cities.
So it's interesting there. They were able to find out that fares had kind of gone down, but perhaps not as much as they would have hoped earlier. Now, that is understandable in that you've got this cost of living crisis. We've had wildly fluctuating prices for jet fuel. One of the last in the previous series of ACCC quarterly reports, back kind of a year or so ago, effectively warned airlines that they needed to get capacity back in the market and bring those prices down. To be fair, airlines did bring the capacity back, but obviously it's been a very difficult last 12 months. What other kind of insight were they able to give us?
Well, it's interesting. They've mentioned that there is now a route. Melbourne to Gold Coast, for the first time, now has 4 different airline groups operating that route. So you've got Qantas Group, Virgin, Rex, and Bonza are all now flying Melbourne Tullamarine to Gold Coast. So this is like a kind of a landmark in competition in the aviation industry. That said, while about half of all domestic passengers in Australia last year flew on routes that were served by 3 or more competing airlines, Rex and Bonza do typically fly fewer services compared to the Qantas Group and Virgin. Qantas Group especially, with Qantas and Jetstar combined.
Now, in addition to that, we also had a separate report by an ACCC chairman that was commissioned by the ACTU, if I've remembered that correctly.
Yes.
Kind of looking at, it looked at a number of different industries and kind of competition and how it affects prices of things, basically. But one of the largest areas it looked at was aviation. What were some of the kind of conclusions of that? Because that came out about a week or so before the kind of the proper ACCC report.
Yeah, so this was a report by former ACCC chairman Alan Fells for the ACTU. It basically said the duopoly, this is a quote, the duopoly in the aviation sector in Australia is dominated by Qantas, and there is price gouging by Qantas. And called for what Fells said was unnecessary restrictions on competition in domestic and international aviation to be removed. Now, Qantas has, of course, come out and denied that it is price gouging. It said in a statement, both Qantas and Jetstar appreciate the importance of affordable air travel. It pointed to this data showing this decline in average airfares from that peak in late December, in December 2022. Qantas said sale fares are frequently available, with Qantas offering an average of 17 network-wide sales per year, and Jetstar offering 10 million fares for less than $100 last year. Now, Qantas has also said that Australia is one of the most liberalised aviation markets in the world. Said unlike a lot of other jurisdictions, there are no restrictions on foreign carriers setting up domestic operations here. While the domestic market is concentrated, it is still highly competitive. There are now 4 large jet operators, with Regional Express expanding onto mainline routes and the entry of Bonza. Australia has open skies agreements with key markets, including the US, UK, New Zealand, and China, and consumers can choose from over 50 airlines that offer international services from Australia.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, yes, so they're saying it's one of the most liberalised countries for air travel. They are talking about their number of open skies agreements, which effectively allow the market to decide when international flights happen. But it is also the case that to have a local aviation industry in which one player has 65 to 70%, depending on how you divvy it up, is fairly extraordinary.
It is.
And it's also fairly extraordinary for a very wealthy country with a decent-sized population.
And keep in mind as well that, for the longest time during the 20th century, Australia, by law, had 2 domestic airline groups. It was TAA/Australian, which later merged, with Qantas, and it was Ansett, and that was it. So now the laws mandating the duopoly are gone, but one could possibly argue that the effects of those of that long time Qantas Ansett duopoly have kind of remained, because Qantas is still the biggest airline group in Australia, and there's still only one major competitor to it, which is Virgin. Admittedly, Virgin, not Ansett, very famously, but it's kind of Qantas has for a very long time been the beneficiary of a lot of a very big beneficiary of the way things are in the Australian aviation sector. And it's had all that time. TAA and Australian Airlines had all that time to sort of build itself up. When Ansett collapsed, there was really no other major competitor until Virgin Blue really came along and took up a whole bunch of that market. So, Qantas and Jetstar have had it pretty good for a pretty long time.
Yeah, and I will throw this over to you in a little bit to talk about this. But basically, Jake interviewed a very fascinating interview with Tim Jordan, the CEO of Bonza, and he said a number of things about competition. But one of the things that we ran as a kind of a separate story that was quite fascinating is that he obviously found outside investment or foreign investment from 777 partners to come in and launch Bonza. But he basically said, I was trying to make this work for like nearly a decade or so, and he had multiple discussions with local investors to see if they would get on board with his idea. And what he basically said was almost that what he was told was the duopoly of Qantas and Virgin was so impregnable that no investor wanted to come near it. I mean, so in that sense, this kind of duopoly and the power of Qantas, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in that you just forever lock out any kind of rivals and you make it more and more and more and more difficult. He also said some other things as well about the problem with airport monopolies. And so just to give you a little bit of background, Australia, not entirely uniquely, but
we have discussed this on the podcast before.
Exactly. The idea that in Australia, all the states effectively have one major big airport, which means they are a monopoly. If you want to fly in there, all the airlines have to deal with one particular airport. Tim spoke a little bit about that. What did he say?
Yeah, so Tim Jordan had some particularly high praise for Melbourne because Bonza flies both to Avalon and Tullamarine. And he said they have their own distinct catchments. So Australia has Melbourne doing that. He said that Sydney is going to have Western Sydney International doing that when it opens in 2026. So, the Western Sydney Airport and Sydney Airport will serve those different catchment areas. And, he said that, Bonza would dearly love to serve one of them immediately, the other one in 2026. But he said, why stop there? this is a quote from him, why couldn't there be multiple airports in Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth? Airport monopolies are not necessarily good for the aviation industry. Strangely enough, if there's more than one airport in a location, it's generally good for airlines and very good for customers as well. We'll all have our preference for our local airport. So he said, in terms of Sydney, we would like to think of serving both Sydney airports in the way we already today service both Melbourne airports because they have their own independent catchments. And there was some discussion as well in the Facebook comments, surprisingly civil, on this story, talking about, people saying, Brisbane kind of has like Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast and Toowoomba, as well as kind of like secondary airports. Perth, Bustleton, Margaret River could be a secondary airport for Perth. So it's there's airports around the country, like smaller regional places, not far from the major capital cities that could serve as secondary airports. But I think Margaret River is something like 2 hours from the Perth CBD. And even in Sydney, we do have Newcastle, a couple of hours away.
Australia's in a very, very unique position for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's a country that is extraordinarily wealthy, actually, sort of relative to its population. But it's also a country that is expanding very rapidly. So its population has grown enormously, I say over the last 10 years, over the last 20, 30 years. And when you think about not just building an airport, it's not a simple thing. It's almost 10, 15 years in the making. So you've got the fact this country is kind of constantly changing, that the population is dispersed. That's one of the reasons why we have monopoly airports. So this is a difficult thing to plan for. If you're in a more built up country, or even if you're in Europe, it's much more easy to justify these things. So in a sense, Australian aviation, not us, the lowercase a, is in this kind of no man's land where it needs to think about what it's going to do in 20, 30 years.
Which is what this white paper is for.
Yeah, exactly, which is what the government's white paper, looking at what the future of the industry will be like and giving a kind of what's meant to be a rough pathway forward for the industry. We are starting to see the sort of the green shoots of forward thinking with Western Sydney Airport, which will be for the first time kind of re-break those monopolies. But this is definitely something that we need to think about to increase competition moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah. And to your point, Adam, Tim Jordan has pointed out, on a few occasions, it's been, 20 years since Virgin Blue started up. It's been like 30 years since Qantas. Australia has not seen new major players in the airline market for some time. And, back in the early 90s when, I think it was the early 90s when Qantas was getting going, there was not a lot of people. There was not nearly as many people in Australia as there are now. And even 20 years ago, when Virgin Blue was starting up, there were not as many people in Australia as there are now. And I think Virgin Blue may also have benefited a bit from the demise of Ansett. So that might have helped them get going a bit. But, Bonza is kind of has entered the market in a time where there is, a lot more people that could justify its existence in a way that Qantas could not back in the 90s.
Wow. And this is going to be a local radio DJ link. We talk about the future and we talk about your interview with Tim Jordan. We're going to talk a little bit about the next issue of the Australian Aviation magazine, which will be coming out on printed paper and also going online. I think you will have it, God willing, on your doormats in the next week or two. It will be going out to subscribers. So we're going to talk a little bit about this now. We have an interview with Tim Jordan, which Jake has just spoken about, which will also be a podcast as well, which will go to our subscribers. Hopefully we'll get that up in the next week. We're also looking at the kind of next generation of aircraft that are going to be coming to or have just started to arrive in Australia. And this is because Qantas received the first of their A220s, which is their effectively the first next generation aircraft of their Project Winton plan to completely change and overhaul their fleet domestically, which is kind of getting on now. And so we look at all of the different aircraft that are arriving because we've had the introduction of the A220, but also because there were two major global incidents involving these next generation aircraft. The first was obviously the incident with the 737 MAX 9, where the door plug came off, and we look at that, and Jake goes and has a look at that. and talks about the kind of reputational damage to Boeing and how they can begin to repair that. We also have a fantastic feature from Hannah Dowling, and yet another former co-host. I keep losing them, don't I?
Yeah, it's the alumni association must be,
which is now growing, but it's absolutely fantastic. I would say the one of the best things that's ever appeared in the magazine. Certainly, her best contribution. A fantastic journalist, and she has looked at almost kind of, to use a journalistic phrase, the kind of inside story behind what happened with the Japan Airways A350-900 that burst into flames in Tokyo. And of course, as you all probably know, the extraordinary thing about this is that everybody on the plane got off. And so she recounts the events of that night and also looks at why they all got off. And without ruining the story for you, two critical elements. One was that these next generation of planes effectively are made of far more modern materials and fuselage materials, are kind of carbon composites and kind of smart plastics, etc. And what these mean is that not only are they a lot lighter than the existing materials, but they're also a lot stronger. And so what this meant is when the plane was up when it was in flames, it was able to survive longer. It gave the people on board more time to get out. But it was also the kind of training that the cabin crew went through, whole kind of new ways of training people to deal with these emergencies, which was less about getting the cabin crew to remember an enormous textbook of things, but it was more about drilling in the basics and also trusting the cabin crew to kind of make decisions sort of on the fly and trust their instincts a bit more. And the idea is if you train people really well to do a few simple things, that's a lot better than trying to overload people with information. Hannah actually speaks to a former cabin crew on that same airline that can talk through what they do. And so it's kind of the inside story. So we've got this whole new next generation of aircraft turning up, a new way of doing things. We've seen the success of things here with the Airbus A350. We've obviously seen the sort of disaster with Boeing still having problems with its MAX, as well as looking at, I'm going to stop ranting soon, breathe, as well as looking at the next generation of aircraft. I'm getting to it. Jake has had an absolutely fantastic feature looking at arguably the most important aircraft in Australian aviation history.
Well, a replica of the most important.
It's the replica of the aircraft. But Jake basically went down to watch the first flight of the Southern Cross.
Public flight.
The first public flight of the Southern Cross.
Adam, this would not be Australian aviation if we did not engage in pedantry.
Yes, exactly, and just extreme details. And just give an introduction. We need subscriptions. We need money, right? Why should they pay some money to read this?
Yeah, this is the story of the original Southern Cross.
Not the replica.
We go through the story of the original Southern Cross and then get to the replica, Adam.
Okay.
We've got the story of the original Southern Cross, obviously flown by Charles Kingsford Smith from America to Australia in the 1920s, and what happened to that. We've got the story of the replica right from its construction through to the crash at Parafield in the early 2000s that took it out of commission, and we have its restoration right through to that first public flight. And I spoke to the lead engineer, Bruce Thurston. Jim Thurston, who put it together, and of course Bruce Thurston and Mark Simpson were the pilots of that first flight. If I am incorrect on those names, Haas, I apologize. But we went down. I saw that first flight. Flew for 15 or so minutes. Great success. Spoke to the pilot. Spoke to the lead engineer. It's a great Australian success story.
It is a great Australian story, and I say Jake did a superb job in writing it. As well as writing it, he also got some fantastic photographs as well, not just of the aircraft that day, but also some amazing historical photos as well, showing the moment when the original Southern Cross first landed on its trip from America, which is absolutely lovely, and a million other things in the magazine as well. Just to quickly talk about, and obviously we've got traffic, we've got Warbirds, we've got Register, and we've also got a lovely little bit on a new NASA supersonic aircraft.
And we've got an inside look into air services.
Yes,
hub in Melbourne. I went
Gonzo
behind the
Germans,
scenes.
isn't
Yes,
it? Yeah.
I went behind the scenes at the Air Services Melbourne control facility. Had a look at the 360-degree tower simulator, the control room, the new CMATS control room, which is going to unify basically all of Australian airspace into one cohesive system between Brisbane and Melbourne. I had a look up in the tower, went to the aviation rescue firefighting training, got suited up in protective personal equipment, and helped put out an actual simulated aircraft fire.
So you mean a firefighter's uniform?
No, firefighter's uniform.
You go.
Yeah, got put on a firefighter's uniform. I got to hold a hose, unlike certain previous former prime ministers. It was a really interesting look at how air services handles so much, because we control in Australia. We're responsible for managing 11% of the world's airspace. So it was a really fascinating look into how that airspace is managed.
All that and more, go to australianaviation.com.au and you'll see the link there to subscribe. We'll probably talk about the issue again a little bit next week. That's probably all we've got time for, because we've got about another 20 minutes to get our newsletter done as we record this.
And we didn't even talk about how there's going to be 60 million drone flights per year.
No, but we will talk
by
about it. No, we
2043.
can't. We've run out of time. Don't do this again. You do this every week.
But
no,
I'm just saying that we didn't talk about it.
We didn't, and we won't, because we must stop. We can talk about it next week.
It is a lot of drone flights.
It is a lot of drone flights. We will be stopping things now. Jake, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much for listening. And we will be back on this show the same time next week. But for now, from us, goodbye.
Goodbye.